When you think of epic fantasy, what's the first thing that comes to mind? Now, that's quite a broad question, but for me personally, it's whoa. Really not sure what got into me there. Well, point is, I like me some dragons. Magic the Gathering, I'm playing the dragon deck. League of Legends, I'm playing the dragon champion. Oh, yeah, that's right, there's two now. It's plural. And in the game where you can literally make your character a dragon, I choose to play a tiefling with a mustache. Anyways, Baldur's Gate 3 isn't immune to the almighty call to place a dragon or two within its game either. Mainly because the Githyanki are prominently featured, bringing along their seemingly endless army of red dragons. And while these suckers certainly are just about what I'm looking for when it comes to a sweet addition of some classic dragons, what I want to talk about here is a little old bronze one that rests beneath the very streets we walked through during Act 3. Because this is epic. And it's not just Ansur himself that's so amazing here. The entire Wyrmway as a whole is just mwah. From start to finish, this dungeon is a story in and of itself, where determined heroes look to claim the title of champion and awaken the heart of the gate, who lies dormant beneath the legendary city of Baldur's Gate. Welcome to Figuring Out Fantasy, where we'll be discussing the thrill of attempting to complete the 4 daunting trials within the Wyrmway, a secret dungeon in Act 3 which exists as the final stint of Wyll's questline, but ends up warping the perspective we have on the entirety of Baldur's Gate's very foundation. Make sure to hit the like button and let me know how much you enjoyed the Wyrmway in your playthroughs down in the comment section below. Now let's get into it. So for those of you who have already watched my previous video on Wyll, you'll know that what I'm going to be discussing here is a bit of an extension to the happenings of that dive into the Blade of Frontiers quest within Act 3. So if you want a bit more continuity to what we'll be going over in this video, I would suggest maybe going over and giving that one a watch first. But either way, we'll find ourselves eventually embarking on our quest to discover the location of the Wyrmway, and subsequently the fabled Roaring Storm deep in its elaborate chambers as soon as we wrap up our tense conversation with Duke Ravengard. Though none of this would be possible without reading over what there is to find within the pages of The Legend of Ansur, which we received from either Cordula Elton, Counselor Floric, or the Duke himself if we managed to save him from the explosive Iron Throne. So I guess we could have realistically decided to take what information the book could offer us after receiving it from either of these two, and disregard everything involved in saving the Duke if we just don't care to bother. And, well, based on some of the comments I was reading under my previous video on that exact dilemma, I don't think too many of you would mind leaving him to his demise. But however we find ourselves in possession of this piece of literature, the contents inside should instill not only a new point of interest in our mind, but a new point of confusion as well. The first section immediately mentions the big man himself, Baldur, along with the goal of this venture to begin with, Ansur, even emphasizing him being tremendous in worth. But what's important here is summed up and added as a note by the Grand Duke. He theorizes that the entrance to the Wyrmway could lie right under our noses within the depths of the Wyrmrock prison, leading into the next portion of the book's contents describing a lightning shock flickering a true hero's spark, and alighting torches of some kind, with Alder pointing out to potentially use lightning skills to solve this portion of the puzzle, leaving the closing segment to not so much give direction, but to paint a picture in our minds as to what awaits for the daring adventurers who are capable of finding the Wyrmway to begin with. When each day sends forth new ones to their fates, but one great hero, by the Founder's will decreed, shall only once grant our age the heart of the gate. Now, after transitioning to this portion of the Blade of Frontiers questline, we will likely explore Baldur's Gate a bit as we backtrack towards the Wyrmrock Fortress. But as soon as we find ourselves back at Basilisk Gate, uh-oh, you don't look like you're in a friendly mode. Well, if we had followed through the course of events as I went over them in my last video, we would have had our little run-in with Gortash where we defied his orders to turn around from the Iron Throne. So we realistically should have expected to be on his shit list going forward. And this kind of accumulation of his forces is exactly the kind of reaction that would come from a man such as him. Now, this makes the note I mentioned about being able to dive into the Legend of Ansur without even saving Duke Ravengard sound a bit better than having to now plow through some of the greatest opposition we'll meet in Baldur's Gate as a whole, the Steel Watch. Though, if you can trounce these opponents in this moment, we'll be able to pass through with a victory under our belt that makes the idea of awakening a whole-ass legendary dragon just a bit easier to digest. Once we make our way back down into the depths of the Wyrmrock prison, our purpose here immediately feels different. We first came down here and felt as if we were trespassing and walking on thin ice, simply due to the fact that we were obviously surrounded by a bit more stalwart of authority than we had experienced prior. Maybe similar to the feeling of being in Moonrise Towers while it was clearly under the control of the Absolute, but this time with these suckers stomping about. Here and now, though, we understand that there are deeper secrets than initially met the eye when we were attempting to rescue Counselor Floric. In the prison's western block is where we'll come across our first bit of evidence potentially leading to what we're after. 2 dragon-shaped fixtures stand out to us not only for their shape, but for their purpose. As pointed out to us in The Legend of Ansur, the way of gaining access to the resting place of the dragon involved the lighting of some torches. And while there's about 5 billion torches that exist in this game, these two here scream ancient dragon perhaps more than anything in the vicinity. But there's more to it than simply finding or interacting with these torches. There was mention of flickering a true hero's spark through means of a lightning shock. So whip out your trusty mage and try not to blast your team. Oops, sorry Wyll, I missed. Well, he needs to suck it up, as we can quickly notice this approach has actually provoked quite the change in these dragon head torches. They'll glow with a blue flame after sparking, and a hidden door seemingly vanishes, revealing an ominous path ahead. It's honestly quite magical to play through this sequence for the first time, as while we've left a not so magical trail of bodies behind us in pursuit of discovering this very location, this delve into the Wyrmway is with the intentions and the tune of saving the city, and preventing even more bloodshed between citizens of the streets above. But as we start to look around this introductory room and take in the surroundings within, we'll begin to realize that this historic piece of architecture has a much greater importance than initially met the eye. Directly to our left, we'll find a wall-donning 3 detailed murals that look to be depicting the history of a dragon and its beloved companion. If we pass a history check on the first mural, our character will be able to glean that the man in the artwork is none other than Baldur, the one we heard of in The Legend of Ansur, being spoken of as the father of Baldur's Gate. And as talked about before, the book also spoke of Ansur being tremendous in worth, but this was after mentioning him as Baldur's very guardian dragon, with our character noting that this is indeed a bronze dragon as well, along with what Duke Ravengard was able to relay to us before we set out for the Wyrmway. We can confirm that this winged ally portrayed here is the very heart of the gate we had heard about. The image on the far left simply shows the two and the bond they've clearly made, but once we get to the second one in the middle, our player character describes it as depicting Baldur and Ansur admiring the fruits of their labor, the city of Baldur's Gate itself, proving to us that the very domain we find ourselves in involves two of the most important individuals to exist within the history of this legendary city. Moving to the final mural on the wall, this one ends up feeling a little different. Our player notes that it shows Baldur sailing away from Baldur's Gate, leaving his bronze dragon to watch over their precious city, but not without questioning whether or not the history books make mention of this even occurring. Wyll even has a similar remark about the last depiction, and with his knowledge of the city having grown up there under a father who's the Grand Duke, it leaves a bit of a mystery in the air as to just what is left of Ansur after having been made to watch over Baldur's Gate alone all these years since, or even why there's seemingly no mention of the bronze dragon except amongst those closest to people like the Grand Duke, who had heard messages passed down from Baldur for ages. But from the note we can find lying on the bench underneath the murals, it seems that another group of adventurers had found their way down here, and they're apparently in the know that this worm exists down here as a part of the Baldur's Gate legends some had passed down for generations. This is only listed as number 1 in a likely series of entries from these brave warriors, so I can imagine that this isn't the last we'll be hearing from them and their experiences. In moving forward though, we won't be able to pass through the door ahead without being given a bit of an introduction from this hunk of stone over here. Well, this isn't just some hunk of stone. It's actually an imitation of Baldur.
Peril floods my province. The palisades fall, the earth does tremble. The servants of shadow and blood assemble. Beyond lies the grand worm, deep in slumber, awaiting a true hero's advent, should my domain drown in torment. Be you the deluge, turn away. Be you the hero, answer true. Are you worthy?
Poetic nonsense. There is no worm and no savior.
As we can learn though, these were pre-recorded messages able to be spoken through the use of magic mouth cast onto these statues. So why would the Emperor be so stern about these messages being a lie when it makes sense for them to be true given how they were recorded so long ago by Baldur himself? And I mean, we know he's all smart and shit being an Illithid, but what the hell do you even really know about this place? I'd think the one who went on all these adventures with Ansur would know whether he's here or not, and I declare our party worthy of being able to attempt the challenges ahead. So let's begin. Upon passing through the doorway and into the innermost area of the Wyrmway, we're met with an almost enchanting feeling as we walk across the bridge and approach the 4 stalwart statues of Baldur. There's plenty of natural vegetation growing here, along with peaceful aluminum butterflies fluttering around these vibrant crystal spires. For a sequence that supposedly has the fate of Baldur's Gate on the line, I honestly love the direction taken with the tranquil nature of the surroundings within. It takes the elements you'd expect out of an endgame quest dungeon with daunting visuals and imposing enemies, and instead approaches the pursuit of awakening a legendary bronze dragon with no real opposition of force, but with a way to prove yourself on a much more heroic level than simple firepower. The first of which exists in the only trial that's in the open space of this room, the Trial of Justice. Now this challenge has many layers to it, and it gives a thrilling outlook on what may be awaiting us deeper in the other trials. Here, we're responsible for examining the crimes of a thief as told across the span of several paintings, but we can't exactly enact justice while the dishonorable judge occupies the center of the room, unwilling to move from his position. So it's our job to find a proper sentencing for the thief in question, while managing to relieve the judge of his duties so that we can smack the gavel ourselves. To solve this trial, you need to get a little creative. You can analyze the paintings all you want, but with the judge where he is, the shrouded sentence effect is casting a shadow over the ones near him, so we can't put what we gather to use, though there are quite a few ways you can remove him. He's undead after all, so he's pretty scared of things like moonbeam or spirit guardians, and any sort of magic which controls the undead. We can also banish him, or even simply turn him into a sheep. There are certainly a few more, but use that brain of yours and find a way to remove him so we can get on and solve this mystery and give the correct punishment. The story told begins with a painting called The Apple, where a man is shown in a crowded street thieving from a local apple vendor. An initial bad impression, yes, but there's a bit of a complication that gets thrown in the mix when we see that the next painting depicts the man handing out these stolen apples to various starving children on the streets. And there's quite a few with their hands held out, so maybe it was an honorable deed? Unfortunately though, in the next image, a cloaked woman in red seems to be meeting with our subject with some obviously devious intentions given the secrecy. Looks like she saw the man's capabilities as a thief as she witnessed just how many apples he was able to steal for the children. I mean, look, she's right there in the previous painting. But in this one, we can identify a bit of historical relevance within the 9 tally marks present on the back of the woman's cloak. If you've dug deep enough within the streets, and more specifically the underground of Baldur's Gate, you might know where this symbol comes from. It's the mark of the Nine Fingers clan that's been so prevalent over the history of the city, and nowadays exists as an underground criminal organization where we can find individuals like Keen and Minsk at the head of its operations. But I'm not exactly sure of the Nine Fingers' relevance as it relates to being a part of the trial down here in the Wyrmway, so maybe you guys could enlighten me in the comments if you have some sort of an idea. Regardless, it seems that this woman instructed him to steal a gilded astrolabe which was so potent it apparently could hold up to 12 djinns or more inside, which leads to him being chased through the streets by many in pursuit of retrieving such a priceless artifact. But not without the shrouded woman in the background watching from a distance. The red-haired man ends up on trial for his actions, and the narrator makes note of the judge having his pockets bursting at the seams with gold. Seems like this trial was never going to be just from the beginning. And so we can assume that the undead being in the center of the room is a depiction of this very judge, and us removing him was the way to get rid of the unjust treatment in the courtroom, leaving the 3 previously shrouded paintings lying on these pedestals to reveal 3 different fates for the man on trial. From left to right, they show him being ultimately executed by hanging for his crimes, getting off with no consequences and even a pretty coin in his pocket, and facing his time for the crimes he committed, being slipped a meal as he counts his days on the wall behind him. Now these are here for us to lay a sentence upon the red-haired man ourselves. Do we hang him, let him go, or make him face time in jail? The course of events in the story paint a polarizing perspective of degree when it comes to just what surrounded the man's thievery. At first he was stealing a few apples to give to some starving children, but then ends up being instructed to steal a much more important item instead, landing him in the hands of the law. The answer may be apparent to you, but if we interact with the statue of Baldur lying at the start of the trial, we can hear some insight from Wyll that may guide us in the right direction.
Justice. No pardon without repentance, and no penalty without mercy. The right path often lies between the extremes. Wise indeed, though I can't take credit. It was my father who taught me the ways of the just.
Well, if the answer lies between the extremes, perhaps the red-haired man should receive a jail sentence that the court deems worthy for the degree of the crimes committed, and the context surrounding them. And placing that specific painting on the larger pedestal alone and separate from the other 3 will solve this trial, and the statue of Baldur will burst with light. And the glow will persist, showing that we have only 3 more trials to persevere. But before we depart to another portion of the Wyrmway to continue our ascent to being declared a champion, we can find the second in the series of journal entries from the previous group of daring adventurers, where the mysterious author seems caught off guard by the fact that the trial set in place to guard a great worm would be in the form of such trivial puzzles that might not feel like they prove real worth. Well, in moving on to the next puzzle in line, this theme will only continue, but it'll start to show just what Baldur's intentions might have been when he recorded these magic mouth messages to begin with. In speaking to his statue as we enter after crossing over this translucent bridge, we'll learn that our task is to find and strike down the individual out of these 3 advisors whose structure of governance would lead the city to ruin.
A good leader has the insight to find good counsel. As a war reaches its end, there is one who doesn't advise for the city's prosperity. Find him and strike him down.
and the information needed in order to make such a decision is hidden within numerous flying books that just... How do you get these things down? I've literally destroyed these books 4 or 5 times finding different ways to try. You throw them. You just have to throw them. And then they'll flap around for a bit. Well, now that we can actually make progress towards solving this puzzle, the contents of these various books will spell out the stances held by each of Stead, Amaps, and Swelto. All 3 have polarizing views in some fashion, but it's our job to sift through these stances on government and pick the odd one out, the one that would lead the city to ruin. So let's start with the first flying book we'll run into, which contains an entry from Alwyn's Stead. Alwyn's approach to ruling a city focuses on the importance of keeping the rights of citizens to a minimum, speaking of how a few charred corpses is a worthy sacrifice if the dragon is willing to share its hoard. She further elaborates to mean that if a slow erosion of the city's rights is what it takes in order to see great riches and prosperity for the city, it's no real skin off their nose. Now this may sound upfront like somebody you want nowhere near your council, but remember here that this task demands us to find the worst of the bunch. And the next one, authored by Christina Swelto, which focuses on advising to be a ruthless conqueror, might edge out the previous piece of literature in this fashion. Swelto seems to question the thought process of passing mercy unto those who they have defeated in battle, preaching ideas of how these spared enemies won't hesitate to gather new armies and march to their doorstep in revenge. So following her logic, it's best to raze these opposing kingdoms to the ground in order to ever be free of their specter. Now, I'm not going to lie, I don't think Swelto's opinions here are any more drastic than those of Alwyn's Stead. But before we get into deeper discussion on it, let's take a look at what views Amaps has to offer. The piece of literature called Amaps' Memoirs will explain the last of the 3 specific ideologies, and this time they concern the concept of enlightenment. Amaps tells of how he looks back fondly on the fact that his own town had been so incorporative of his ideals, like ceasing discrimination against the local orcs in the area and improving the living conditions of factory workers in the city. And it seems like he's a bit regretful that he wasn't able to convince the previous author Christina Swelto of such values and principles, since she had apparently adopted these violent ideals later in life and couldn't be swayed. Well, with the gist of all 3 stories fresh in our minds, it's time for us to make a decision on who to strike down, understanding that their direction of leadership would lead the city of Baldur's Gate to ruin. And while this is a judgment decision on our part at the end of the day, there's one answer that Balduran laid in place for this trial when he created it so long ago. Based on our outcome of the previous trial, we understand that Balduran appreciates a level-headed and reasonable approach to conclusions, with the punishment for the red-haired man being an accurate jail sentence instead of too far one way or the other being hanging or clearing the charges entirely. So with these 3 in front of us, I feel as though we can point to Swelto for having the most dramatic viewpoints, given how they involve the eradication of entire kingdoms as opposed to the other individuals' proposals being much less graphic. And lo and behold, this is the answer Balduran is looking for. If we slay Swelto's image, we pass the trial and can move on to the next one. But if I'm being entirely honest, Swelto's thoughts on ruling were likely the last which I thought would lead a city to ruin. Alwyn Stead literally wants to stifle the rights of the working citizens of its city, thinking in her head that time will heal the quote lesser issues they'd have with owning such little freedom, and that she'll benefit from a subsequent growth in population and in turn a larger economy. Amaps' thoughts are upfront much less destructive, as they preach much more progressive values of enlightenment, but it's not always the message that ends up ruining the city, it's the application. I see Amaps' approach to rulership ending in ruin, maybe not during his stint as part of the council, but in subsequent generations to follow, as it seems very optimistic that the values instilled by his noble perspective would carry on with such integrity as he would employ himself, along with the fact that the very principle of enlightenment must be backed with extensive resources that could eventually burn out the city. So with this approach in mind of Swelto potentially being the one here with an actual sensible form of council, I'm starting to have some questions about just how impressive of a leader this Balduran truly was. But with this trial solved, even though we've got some questions still in the back of our heads, it's time to move ahead. Though before we exit, we might have caught a little scroll propped up before approaching the 3 advisors. And while it initially feels like it speaks more of the same about the relationship between both Ansur and Balduran, the last segment shakes us a bit in anticipation of finding the legendary bronze dragon, as it describes a quote, betrayal too piercing to recount here in worthy detail, which caused Ansur to flee down here and rename its corridors to match his draconic lineage. What exactly happened between these two? Many recounts speak of an unbreakable bond between the two, like even in this very literature. But on the other side of the same coin, there was obviously more that occurred than is being written about in the history books. Moving along, unfortunately there was no 3rd entry to the journals of the past adventurers in this trial as there was in the previous, but potentially we'll come across it as we approach the trial behind the Balduran statue holding a lance board piece? Turns out, yeah, the trial of strategy is very much in the form of a lance board challenge. Alright, I've done about 10 puzzles on chess.com and watched Queen's Gambit. I should be good, right? If we talk to the statue of Baldur present in this trial, we'll find that this is a test of a champion's ability to strategically lead an army to victory. Our goal? It's simple. Fell the Dark King in 2 moves. And if Gale is in our party, this just got a whole lot easier, as he will quite literally take any thought out of the equation and tell us exactly where to move the pieces to get a checkmate. It's a relatively simple solve, but if we didn't have Gale or we didn't know the first thing about chess, we just so happen to be able to brute force our way through this one. If we examine the Dark King, we can notice that it's resistant to all elements except one, lightning. So if we use the same source of magic that we likely utilized to gain access to the Wyrmway to begin with, we can outright crumble the king ourselves. And with a short and sweet trial completed, we're feeling better than ever in our hopes of being able to be declared a champion, and worthy of approaching the worm that'll save the city. But even though we're feeling high and mighty, we might be able to see a note resting on the statue of Baldur on the way out of the room, and it's painting a not so bright situation for the past adventurers we've been keeping up with from their first 2 journal entries. This writing is about as short as this past trial was, as all it has to reveal is that 2 of the adventurers who had gone in unfortunately perished during the trials. The author claims that their death revealed their hubris in taking on these challenges, as they were apparently caught off guard by elementals, with 3 of them remaining after the tragedy. Now, we haven't ran into any elementals ourselves yet, but if they had taken out nearly half of the adventures we're reading about, then we must tread carefully in completing the 4th and final trial. The final statue of Baldur is found holding a sword at his side, which can only spell that this might be the combat trial we were initially expecting to see so many of down here. And once inside, honestly, I could just sit in this area and take in the ambiance for a good while. But we really have no time to waste, and in talking to the statue of Baldur within this trial of courage, he'll preach to us that a true champion shines bright even when rushing waters and moaning winds threaten to extinguish their flame, and we'll have to take up the torch and do anything in our power to make the flames persist across 4 grueling turns, with the spoken of rushing waters and moaning winds manifesting in the form of those elementals we had heard of. This challenge is not for the faint of heart, as going toe-to-toe with these elementals is no joke of a combat encounter. As each of the 4 turns pass by, a ball of lightning will illuminate the circular post spread out around the arena, and if we can survive until they're all lit, the trial will complete, and any elemental still alive will vanish, with nothing left in the area but a glowing statue, proving that we've accomplished our 4th trial and earned the title of champion. But before we lose ourselves in the excitement of seeing what we've earned after completing the 4 trials, the 4th journal entry from the adventures we've kept up with is resting here on the wall, and its contents spell out some confusion as it begins to talk about a surprise from the presence of the lance board trial we completed beforehand, and that the crystals falling from the ceilings are beginning to pose a threat to their lives. Now, I understand that these trials can be completed in any order you choose, and that mine was simply a sequential path around the chambers, but these notes are in backwards locations it seems, and I'm really not sure why. Again, if you guys have anything to add here, please let me know in the comments. Before we move along to the Dragon Sanctum we've so bravely gained access to, there's a hidden 5th entry to this series of journals. Their tale didn't quite end with the 4th one we found on the wall. If you are to fail any of these trials at any point, a skeletal army from each uncleared chamber will appear and try to thwart a false champion from gaining access to Ansur. This can be extremely frustrating to run into if you happen to fail any of these accidentally. The Chamber of Insight. Especially if they're early on, because the massive swarm of skeletal forces can be terribly difficult to overcome if they're being summoned from every trial chamber. But what is a bit convenient is that if we fail any of the trials, the opposing enemies are the only obstacle standing between you and Ansur, since some of them must have rambunctiously destroyed the statue of Baldur to the right of the dragon door. Though what we're after here lies on the body of the fallen champion that spawns in the center of the Wyrmway in front of all the statues, the 5th journal entry from the adventurers. Yet another simple one like we found in the Chamber of Strategy, but this time far more grim. It appears that the author was the last of his party left alive, and that they were ultimately deemed unworthy of being a champion. But he felt death calling, and he ultimately remarks that he wishes to prove himself worthy in death by defending the heart of the city. So then, this fallen champion is that very adventurer, fallen in his attempt to awaken the city's savior and animated from the dead to prevent the next faulty champions from passing deeper. Though this scenario, again, is only present when you fail one of the trials. But had you succeeded in passing all 4 daunting challenges, when we return to the center room, we'll find ourselves gaining access to an ominous set of stairs. Lined with an even denser presence of the crystal spires we had seen throughout the Wyrmway already, we can certainly tell that what lies beyond is what everything we've been through alongside our party members, and most specifically Wyll, has all led up to. In passing down the stairs, we'll find ourselves in the Dragon Sanctum, though the room we enter feels like more of what we just dug through for quite a while. If we travel deeper, we'll find that this room leads to a much grander opening in the cave system it's a part of, and in the center lies a dead dragon? He's dead? Oh no! Carl, what are we gonna do? Well, I just busted my ass completing 4 stupid trials, so you better have some good loot on you. Uh-oh.
The dragon's spirit floods your mind and memory in a great torrent of power. He is with you. He is within you. He is you.
Hey, yo.
The next words that spill from your mouth are not yours, but the worm's.
I am Ansur, heart of the gate, butchered in flesh, risen in spirit. Answer me, Facey. Why have you come?
Oh, well, I don't know, Mr. Dragon. To save your city?
Brack, my words aren't meant for you.
Oh, thank God. Now can you put me down?
They're meant for him.
The Emperor stirs in the astral prison, then in you. Calm, curious, and detached.
Baldur,
Excuse me?
your presence has stirred me, as it ever did. I am awakened. Ansur,
You've got some explaining
it's
to
been
do.
too long.
Baldur? No. I don't believe it.
A name I once answered to. A name I did not expect to hear again. Least of all from the mouth of an old friend. Friend. Yes. And more. Until you killed me. Have you come to dance on my bones, Balduran? Was slaying me not satisfaction enough? Satisfaction? No. You left me no choice. You had every choice. You were becoming illithid. I offered you merciful death. You chose to fight. And now you bring your thrall before me.
Okay, I'm catching strays for no reason.
How far has the great Balduran fallen? Dear Ansur, enough! I gave you everything, Balduran. And you repaid me in slaughter. It is time I return the favor. I am the heart of the
Whoa, 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 whoa! I don't like him either. Why do we have beef?
Let my bones rise and the storms gather. Witness Balduran. The final tempest has come. This time, you will not escape it.
Now, I've briefly been over this encounter in a previous video I did discussing the Emperor's narrative from start to finish, but I didn't have the room to fit in the overarching plot of delving down here in an attempt to prove ourselves as champions, and subsequently attempt to awaken the potential savior of Baldur's Gate, which is what really adds that extra element of having literally everything we've experienced across all 3 acts with our Dream Guardian and subsequently the Emperor come together in one shockingly tragic reveal. I think I'm starting to realize why the Emperor was so emphatic about there being no worm down here when we first entered. He had played a hand in this legend in a way that goes against everything told about in any history books in Baldur's Gate, and it leaves us with a sour taste in our mouths as we're forcibly thrown into arguably the most thrilling boss encounter in the entirety of the game, because now instead of awakening the legendary worm that was intended to save the city from the dark cloud looming over it, our hand has been forced in a way that we now have to defeat that legendary worm on behalf of an individual who we just learned has been keeping far more from us than we already knew he was. Ansur is a hell of a fight, and I'm not ashamed to admit that I had to reload quite a few saves in my efforts to adjust to how hard of an encounter this was going to be. And it's just so bittersweet to fight this guy and see what he's capable of. Because if there wasn't such a dark and twisted history between him and Liar Pants on Fire, we could have utilized such explosive power to finally feel like we're in the driver's seat when it comes to expelling the might of the Absolute. But ultimately, we'll have to fell this mighty opposition, and upon inspecting his corpse after finally laying the agitated soul to rest, we'll find a piece of writing from Baldur to Ansur which will change the perspective you have on what we've come to know as our closest ally, forever. But that'll have to be saved for next time, as we're already running a bit long here as it is. Don't worry though, an entire episode of Figuring Out Fantasy dedicated to such a dense topic will let me leave no stone unturned when laying judgment on their conflict. With the end card here though, why don't you entertain yourself with some of my other videos while you wait for the next one? Yeah, go on. What's that one about? Astarion? Ooh, that's a good one. Oh, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't. I mean, if you're still listening to me at this point in the video, you must like my channel enough to click a button, right? Anyways, bye!